All right, it's 9:03. I think we should probably get started. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. A really great group of folks here today. I'm really excited by the level of engagement and participation. A few housekeeping items we'd like you to be aware of. So as attendees in the webinar, your cameras will be turned off and everyone's going to be muted. If you do have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can enter questions there. And we're going to do a Q&A session at the end in the last 10 or 15 minutes to address all the questions at that time. We're recording this presentation today and we're going to make it available when it is ready. If you see or hear something from our panelists today that you'd like more info about, feel free to send us an email or contact us in the chat in Zoom, and we can set up a private meeting anytime. We'd love to connect and continue the conversation. And also our contact information is going to be listed in the last slide of the session today, and we'll also email it out to folks. So we're here to kind of begin the discussion about cloud analytics and refrigeration management. So let's jump right in. And folks, are you able to see my slides?
Yep, you're up and running.
Good. All right. So as I mentioned just a second ago, the purpose of today's conversation is basically to talk about data-driven refrigeration management and talk about how cloud analytics are coming to refrigeration in the cold chain, in grocery, in refrigerated warehouses. Cloud analytics are already being used in every adjacent industries. Many companies are working to bring cloud analytics to this space today. Axiom is one of them. There's many other companies also working on that same thing. We want to start a conversation with the industry and the industry leading stakeholders about how cloud analytics is going to transform how commercial refrigeration is powered, operated, and maintained. And so again, as you can see in the bottom here, please submit your questions in the Q&A, and we'd love to chat about them towards the end of today's discussion. So in terms of panelists, today we have myself. My name is Amrit. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Axiom Cloud. We are a SaaS company. We use software to transform refrigeration. We also have Pete Cuneo, who I'm sure a lot of you folks already know. He is with SEER2. Pete has a really interesting background, having been on both sides of the fence, both as a retailer or an end user of refrigeration and as a vendor or supplier or energy expert on the vendor side of refrigeration. And so he brings a lot of experience and expertise when it comes to maintenance and energy optimization for grocery very broadly, and a lot of deep expertise in refrigeration more specifically. Tristam Coffin is currently with Effecterra. Tristam also has experience being on both sides of the fence, both as an end user and as a service provider and a consultant. And so Tristam was previously with Whole Foods for many years, working on energy and sustainability, where obviously he touched refrigeration very extensively. And now he's on the other side of the fence, helping a lot of different retailers in grocery and in other industries become more sustainable. And I'm sure that he's leveraging his experience in refrigeration through that work as well. So we're really, really excited to have you guys here with us today. Thanks for being a part of this conversation. So let's jump right in. Let's see, next slide. So I want to start by setting the table here. What are we actually talking about? We're talking about central refrigeration systems in a grocery store. And if you think about the total life cycle cost of a refrigeration system, so there's the CapEx, there's the ongoing maintenance and the ongoing energy, only about 10% of that total cost is CapEx. The other 90-ish% is coming in the form of monthly energy bills and service calls and maintenance calls and all kinds of replacements and repairs and PMs and all these other things. And so cloud analytics is not going to help as much with the CapEx portion. It's going to help with the other 90% chunk of this pie, which is clearly very, very important. And one of the reasons that it's so important is because in retail grocery, according to the FMI numbers that are publicly available, grocery stores are spending more money every single month to power and maintain their refrigeration systems than they take home in net profits. And so, I want to let that sink in. That entire fact, that's one of the key drivers of why cloud analytics is so important in this space, because these costs, these line items on the P&L of a grocery chain are larger than profit, just powering and maintaining refrigeration. So today, what we're going to talk about is what we believe are some of the largest problems that are being faced by facilities and sustainability and compliance and energy and maintenance folks in retail grocery and refrigeration. And so these problems, I'm sure you guys have talked about these in great detail, great length with many different stakeholders. And a lot of them are seemingly unrelated. You know, these super painful problems, they seem really disparate, unrelated, but in reality, we view them as all being very connected. You know, these four key problems that we're going to talk about today that energy and facilities managers face are rising energy costs, shortage of qualified technicians, refrigerant compliance requirements that are changing and very confusing and expensive, and then facilities and maintenance staff that are simply so busy putting out fires they don't have enough time or resources to really dramatically improve the status quo or push the ball forward. They're just kind of sprinting to stay in place. And so the way that all these things are connected is via cloud analytics. These super disparate problems, each one of these can be really dramatically impacted by using a playbook that's already been applied so successfully in many adjacent industries. And that is getting data out of those machines, out of those refrigeration systems and controllers, sending that data to the cloud, using analytics and AI and ML to transform that data into actionable insights, and then ultimately using automation to transform those insights into action and business outcomes and savings and new revenue and things like that. So today we're going to talk about how cloud analytics can help address these four really painful problems. I'm really excited to bring Pete and Tristam's voices into the conversation. So we'll take them one by one. First up is rising energy costs. So obviously, energy is really top of mind for folks. It's one of the biggest line items on the P&L, especially in the facilities portion of retail grocery. And optimizing refrigeration is not a one and done solution. It requires constant monitoring. And so that's one of the topic areas we want to talk about today, is that you can't simply go in and tune up a grocery store and then walk out the front door and come back 10 years later and expect everything to be okay. So Tristam, Pete, I want to bring you guys in here. What are your thoughts on this topic about refrigeration optimization, energy optimization being an ongoing process? And are there examples of backsliding that you've seen out in the space that are common? And then how do you guys think cloud analytics can ultimately help to solve this problem? So why don't we start with you, Tristam?
Yeah, thank you, Amrit. Pleasure to be here. Well, I mean, you framed it well. I think most folks know in the grocery space that utilities, largely energy, are the second largest expense for grocery retailers after labor, and it's huge expense, as you just outlined. That profit quote that you gave is pretty significant. Grocers are operating on razor thin margins, and energy is a significant impact to them. So yeah, and I think as it relates to refrigeration, I mean, it is the lion's share. It's effectively a third of the energy usage within the grocery space, splitting that with HVAC, lighting, and other process loads. The challenge with refrigeration is that it hasn't evolved quite as quickly as some of these other areas, right? We've seen leaps and bounds, kind of jumps in terms of advanced HVAC controls, and refrigeration has kind of been this, I don't want to say stagnant market, but it's oftentimes overlooked, and refrigerants are included in that equation as well. And I think part of the problem is that, we've relied on, kind of break fix solutions for generations now. You build it and you forget it. And we need to start moving beyond that. And I think one of the things that we've been thinking about, and as we've talked about with you, Amrit, and team, is that we need to move from a diagnostics approach, right? Whereas, we understand that there's going to be issues with refrigeration performance and lack of optimization, and move to more of a prognostic approach, whereby we find the issues before they happen and address them, so that we really rely on a more optimized and efficient system that delivers lower energy costs, lower energy usage, and better better reliability for the owner operators that are operating these systems, and really just trying to sell food and keep that food cold is the most important piece.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And then Pete, one thing that you said when we were chatting about this ahead of time was somebody will hit the override button. So I was wondering, Pete, if you could kind of talk about that. When you go in and do something really well intentioned, put some new energy measures in place, but ultimately they don't really end up providing value or the value that you had hoped.
Yeah, the overrides are the easiest part because that we can see. The insidious part is once you've optimized the store and essentially you've lowered the compression ratio on the compressor. So it's running as minimally amount as possible. What that depends on is no motor failures, no condensers getting dirty, no TXV strainers plugging up, all of which are going to happen. And if nobody is on top of that and recognizing that you've had these failures, incrementally you see slippage. So you've got to have some way of identifying that even though you optimize that store as well as you could on your visit, you have to have some alarm mechanism that alerts you that energy is being wasted, even though there's no product temperature alarms. And that's where the cloud can really come in handy by disseminating some of that information.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You have it listed right here on the slide, but visibility of the problems, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. It's also about how you get that information or that data into the hands of the right people that can address that. And, Pete's a perfect example of that. Giving someone like Pete more ammunition to be able to visualize and understand where the issues are arising from, to be able to help solve those problems, is incredibly important. I've had the pleasure of working with folks like Pete over the years, and he saved us as a owner operator on multiple occasions. And I think had we had these tools dating back to when Pete and I started working together, we would have been in a far better position than we were at that time.
Yeah, this is just such, and it seems like a tale as old as time in this space. We're dealing with a lot of the same problems, and it doesn't seem like there's a real solution for them right now.
Yeah, but now you're developing tools that are direct answers to those problems that have been going on for 30 years.
Yeah, and the cool part is that this is a playbook. This is not new. It's not like we're developing this from scratch, us or any of the other companies working on this. This is a really proven playbook. So another kind of example that I find personally very compelling is, when Axiom is going into a new set of stores, we're finding that over 70% of the stores that we touch for the very first time, even if they have suction float running and technically it's turned on and it's running, it's not providing value. And so, or not nearly as much value as the retailer end user believes it is or hopes it is. And so, we put out a blog post talking about the 10 ways to beat the float, because we've seen just so many different ways that even if the float's running, it's not necessarily providing value. And we have a very strong suspicion that this trend is occurring industry-wide, based on the data set that we've seen thus far. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that topic about, float being turned on, but not ultimately providing value.
It's a everyday occurrence, quite frankly, and it's not necessarily technician malfeasance, although that certainly plays a part. But it really is as simple as the critical case on a suction group can't hit its set point by 1/10 of a degree. That's all it takes. And now your float's disabled until somebody takes action on that mechanical issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just echo what Pete said. I think it's not necessarily a result of the technicians not doing the right thing. Don't get me wrong. I think in some instances that override button is hit or adjustments are made and it throws the float off. But I think more often than not, it's a systemic issue that is just, kind of rampant in the space. And yeah, all it takes is one other function of the system being slightly off to, I guess, remove the potential energy savings or remove the float altogether, and therefore the energy savings associated with it.
Yeah. We found it's a difficult conversation to have with end users, to say, hey, we understand that you think you're doing really well with energy, but unfortunately, maybe the most powerful energy measure that is at your disposal is not being implemented, is not providing the value that you think it is. So it's a really difficult conversation to have, but ultimately you have to have that conversation if you're going to solve the problem. So, that's where cloud analytics can help. It's, making sure that that is not happening invisibly, and then, watching drift over time and solving it as it happens rather than months or years later. So in the interest of time, staying on track here, I'm going to jump to the next problem. And you guys actually provided a really nice segue to this, talking about technicians. So there is I talk to folks every single day, and they are getting red in the face. They're beating their fists on the table. They are, feeling despair about this massive shortage of qualified technicians in the space. I mean, this is just such an acute pain point for seemingly every person that I talk to in the space over the past years. And so I think this is leading to a lot of problems that are now going well beyond maintenance into just the overall retail grocery business model, unfortunately. It's really starting to have major downstream effects. So, we'll talk about a couple kind of specific examples today. One, reactive maintenance, or kind of deferring fixes of problems, is leading to an acute shortage of technicians during heat waves. So, we hear stories of techs working 30 hours a week during the winter and then 100 hours a week during the summer. So I'm wondering, how have you guys thought about this sort of problem in the past, Tristam and Pete, and how might cloud analytics help with that sort of problem?
Well, go ahead, Tristam. You had it off.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, this is a this is a rising concern. I mean, I think most folks on the call probably realize that the average age of a technician in the refrigeration space these days is about 55 years old. So, and there isn't a whole lot of new blood coming into this area, which is unfortunate, and is a whole nother issue that we could spend probably a ton of time on. So, do I believe that we can solve that issue entirely with technology? No, but we can certainly supplement a lot of the lack of bandwidth in this space and the lack of technicians, especially during high demand times, whether it be the increasing heat waves that we're experiencing summer over summer or the like, with technology. And I think we need to pull out kind of all the stops and start to look at kind of a combination of solutions to address the technician shortage. And I think part of it, like you said, is a perfect segue from what we were saying before, giving the technicians visibility. In many respects, I believe that tools like Axiom Cloud and others that you mentioned, Amrit, that are out there, getting those in the hands of the technicians is almost more valuable than getting them into the hands of the end users, because the technicians are the ones that can utilize this. I think it is the business model and the kind of split incentive component that needs to be solved for in order to really leverage the value that these type tools can bring to the space. And I wish I had an answer for how we do that. I think, there's plenty of ideas that we could talk through, probably not in a 40-minute time period, but, there's certainly a lot of opportunities, like I said, to leverage and try to break down that barrier, that split incentive between the owner operator and the technicians themselves, and how these tools are best utilized.
Can you talk a little bit more about that split incentive problem, since you brought that up?
Yeah, well, I mean, so right now, I think a lot of the owner operators are the ones that are being targeted with these SaaS-based solutions, right? And but if you look at the reality of the owner operators and their bandwidth and ability to be able to utilize these solutions, it really doesn't exist, quite honestly. So ideally, you have to get into the hands of the folks that are doing the work, give them the visibility. But the challenge there is that you have to figure out how the money flows, if we're being completely honest, right? Like, the owner operators are the ones trying to save the money, and the service providers are the ones that are providing the service, and they still need to make the money. So you need to figure out how to make sure that there is a value flow that works, rather than creating a split incentive situation whereby the owner operator only wins and the service provider doesn't, or vice versa, for that matter.
Pete, any thoughts on this?
Well, a lot of that crosses over. The shortage of qualified technicians and the reactive maintenance, that there's a cost to bear for the owner operator. If that case is demerchandised, you've lost sales, you've had the labor to pull the product, the labor to put it back in. So it's not just the cost of the repair. And the other thing you've got up here about the simple fixes don't need to require techs. That's an absolute true statement. We perform that service with remote analytics with humans. It's time consuming and maybe a little more expensive than we'd like it to be, but there's still value there. So if you could streamline that process and fix the stuff that can be fixed remotely without a tech, would be great. But the other flip side is, if somebody can intelligently analyze what's going on, you can point the technician to what the problem likely is and just save his hours on the call. So those things would help everybody, but you got to have somebody get the right information. And there's only so many people like that around. So that's where AI has a spot in this space. It can definitely be done.
Yeah, I think you guys are hitting the nail on the head here. So there's obviously identifying problems is a really big component. And AI and cloud analytics can help with that. And then it's about, how do we triage and batch these problems so that, number one, we're reducing the total number of truck rolls by fixing a lot of problems without any on-site visit at all, or taking the problems that do require on-site visits and then, prioritizing them and batching them in ways that make a lot of sense. So that there's fewer total number of truck rolls and we're dealing with the most important, most valuable problems first.
Yep.
And then I think the third piece that you mentioned, Pete, is really about once that technician walks into the grocery store, what happens next? And what you had mentioned previously, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Rather than asking the tech to go and figure out what the problem is, tell them what the problem is and where it is and how to fix it before they even walk into the store, in order to reduce the total length of the site visit, and then also the total number of those truck rolls of additional techs coming to visit, or mistakes being made, or band-aids being applied and then unapplied and then ultimately fixed, et cetera.
No, there's no question. There's so many young guys, they're well-intentioned, but they just don't have the skill set, quite frankly. But even more important, so many stores have been remodeled time after time after time, and just the simple documentation to tell the technician, what exactly am I supposed to be working on? He can see the case, but if he has no idea what it's tied to or what it's controlling, I've personally seen a couple hours of a guy just trying to figure out, where do I even start? And you could cut that time out completely just by having a fairly informed opinion of where the problem likely lies, and at least give the guy a fighting chance.
Yeah,
I think honestly that would be a good outcome, is that they spend a couple hours and they figure it out. I think a worse outcome that we've seen is that the technician doesn't understand what's going on, and then they leave, and then they send a colleague back a couple of days later.
Yeah,
or even a worse outcome is they make some changes in the store, which are a Band-Aid fix. We'll talk more about Band-Aid fixes a little later, but basically it may solve the problem for that day, but ultimately makes a lot of things a lot worse in the long run.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Root cause is not where folks normally go, right? I mean, and you just said we're going to talk a little bit more about Band-Aid fixes, but I think going back to that split incentive piece is we do need to still solve for that in large part because truck rolls are where the technicians and the service providers do make some of their money. I believe they're already incentivized by the fact that they're limited on bandwidth and they don't want to be going back to the stores. And I think we also assume positive intent, right? I don't think anyone is trying to roll trucks constantly to make more money. I don't think that's the case at all with the service providers, because they provide a lot of value and they're partners to the owner operators, and we've always had a great relationship with them. But that is also where they make money, and if they get removed from the equation altogether because these problems can be solved, I think that's where some of it needs to be taken into account on the split incentive front. I think again, being able to point folks in the right direction is critically important. And Pete just touched on it, whether you have someone that's, just out of the apprenticeship or whatever the case may be, a lower level technician walk into the stores. I can't tell you how many times on the owner operator side, I was called by one of our store managers or store team leaders saying, I only want this technician in my store going forward. I don't want to see any of these other folks. And that's in large part because they would see that one person show up multiple times to try to fix the same issue, and the issue wasn't getting fixed. Instead, by the time they sent the third person out and they actually fixed it, that person became the hero, and it was only because they had more experience. So if we can point folks in the right direction, that lower level technician, to what the solution needs to be earlier in the process, I don't think the owner operators will have to deal with those tough calls to their facilities folks saying, I only want to see this technician. They'll be okay with seeing any of the technicians because they'll all be better equipped to solve the issues on the first run. And again, I think a lot of that goes back to having the tools and visibility, but it also is really critically important that they can solve the issue at the root versus the Band-Aid fixes as you were referencing.
Yeah, and let's the Band-Aid fixes is a big conversation all in and of itself. So thank you guys for those perspectives. I want to pivot us now to the next topic, refrigerant compliance, and then we'll come back to those Band-Aid fixes, I promise. We want to end there. So, refrigerant compliance is obviously very top of mind. There's at least one key stakeholder at every major retailer who is thinking about this. They're concerned about it. In most cases, they're confused by it because there's so many mixed messages and changing messages every time from the political establishment, which is changing all the time, et cetera, about what is allowed, what's not, what's good, what's bad, and then technology is changing quickly as well. So obviously, reducing scope 1 emissions, it means reducing refrigerant leaks. That's basically what that means in retail grocery. So the idea here is that, setting the stage for folks who might not know this, today operating a refrigeration system, there's no kind of needle or indicator that shows you how much refrigerant is inside of that system that's very accurate. You can see in some cases locally how much is right here in this device sitting right in front of me, but more broadly and globally throughout the entire, however many, 10,000 feet of pipe throughout my entire store, how many pounds or gallons of refrigerant are there in this particular grocery store? And the answer is typically, we have no idea. And so I like to equate that to driving down the highway in your car, and there's no needle that shows you how much gas is in your car. And so you're driving down the highway and everything's fine. And then you're on the side of the road because you ran out of gas and you had no idea that it was coming, but now it's a huge emergency and now you're calling AAA or, and begging for someone to come pick you up. That's the status quo of retail grocery today when it comes to refrigerant and how much of it is inside of their refrigeration system at any given time. And so obviously there's business continuity issues associated with that lack of information. If you suddenly run out of refrigerant and all your food gets warm, that's really, really bad. There's compliance issues. Because if you're running out of refrigerant, the refrigerant doesn't get used up. That means it's getting leaked, and so suddenly you have very, very expensive refrigerant replacement to do, and then a lot of paperwork for the EPA and CARB and all these other government bodies that are going to be upset about leaks. So, long story short, the lack of a gas tank needle, if you will, for refrigerant is leading to a higher leak rate. That's one of the core hypotheses that we have, and Tristam and Pete would love to hear your thoughts on that. And the thought is that if we can put a digital gas needle on our refrigeration system and watch that really carefully over time, that's going to help to catch leaks earlier and therefore get them fixed earlier, so that you're reducing the total leak rate, you're reducing those business interruptions associated with running out of gas, et cetera. So, Tristam, being on you were more recently on the retailer side. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I think it goes beyond measuring just the gas or liquid within the system too. I think it, as we've talked about, earlier in the call, it's about understanding the health of the system as well, right? So not just, catching the leaks earlier, but as I mentioned before, this isn't about diagnostics, it's about moving to prognostics and addressing the leak before it actually happens, right? So, and that's critically important. We've been having a lot of conversations recently is, 0 is an absolute number. And if, folks are going to meet zero carbon or carbon equivalent emissions, there can be no leaks. And even in the CO2 system where, you have a GWP of 1, if you're leaking CO2, you're putting carbon emissions into the atmosphere, right? So we have to get to a point where we change the paradigm of all systems leak, we need to find the leaks sooner and fix them sooner, to no systems leak. And, that it's going to be challenging. I mean, catastrophic things happen, but if we're only seeing catastrophic leaks as a result of, accidents versus, daily kind of wear and tear, routine maintenance issues that pop up and cause leaks, then, we're at least getting closer to that absolute number of 0. So it's critically important, not just from a refrigerant compliance perspective. Compliance is the bare minimum, right? That's what you need to be in compliance so that you're not getting tagged from a regulatory perspective. I think you see a lot of organizations out there that are setting science-based targets that have these goals of reaching zero in the next, decade, call it 15 years, whatever the case may be. And that's going to continue to increase and put additional pressure on the industry that we're talking about, to address this. And one of the ways to do that is exactly what we're talking about today, using cloud analytics, using the tools at our disposal to identify issues before they become an issue in the first place.
So Pete, as someone who has dealt with a lot of back-rack sniffers and parasense, detection methodologies, and now some of the new infrared technologies in grocery stores to detect leaks, can you talk about kind of, what is the status quo? What's going on in the industry today? What have you seen that's working? What do you think are still some of the big problems that are outstanding, and how might cloud analytics help with some of those?
Well, the infrared technology is much more solid now than it was about 10 years ago, where you had a lot of hardware failures and false alarms. But we're not seeing that anymore. These are very accurate, but you got to use them and set them up properly. To Tristam's point, not sure I agree that we can get down to leak will never happen. I think they're going to happen. So the intention would be to detect it as quickly as you can and fix it so you don't have to add any more refrigerant. And that's where infrared can really help you. But you got to have detection, not only where it's currently in today, which is the equipment rooms and for life safety reasons in the walk-ins, but they just ignore the sales floor. The cases can leak just as easily. And there's a cost to doing this, but it's risk reward, right? It's going to cost you a little bit up front, but the more points that you could detect is refrigerant flowing, the quicker you can get to that problem and take action on it. As far as the receiver level, Amrit, I think you misspoke a little bit. You were calling for a digital gauge. What we want to go to is an analog gauge, something that tells you the actual percentage that's in the receiver. It's a simple retrofit, but in conjunction with the infrared technology, it does take a little bit of smarts because that receiver level is never static. It's constantly in motion. And there are major changes like heat reclaim and condenser split that can drastically change the level, but you can intelligently infer what the level should be in each of those states. And you can detect a small leak, 2% a week is dropping, and take action on it. Unfortunately, it's still going to involve a technician to find and fix the leak. So we're back to square one there, but identifying it is the absolute key. The days of setting your low receiver alarm at 10% and waiting for that level to drop there is over with. You've got to set that level up higher and be more aggressive with your alarming.
So the status quo is basically you have that digital level sensor at 20% in your receiver. You have a sniffer, which is sniffing the walk-ins and it's sniffing the mechanical room. And then the slow leaks that you're seeing on the sales floor, which are a large percentage of the overall leaks, right now are really going undetected until you're hitting a low threshold on the receiver.
Right.
So kind of after you've missed the boat.
Exactly. Yeah, the leak repair is going to have to take place. The only question is how much gas are you going to lose and how much you're going to have to add.
Yeah. Yeah, Tristam, I would be really surprised if we can get all the way to zero. I love your optimism, though. I think I come down more on Pete's side here, where in my opinion, it's about, how do we go from where we are today, 25% average leak rate across all grocery stores in the US is the number I most recently heard. Have you guys heard similar numbers?
Yeah, no, 25% is the average that's being floated around there by Green Chill and Carb and plenty of others. And look, I believe we can get to zero tomorrow? Absolutely not. I mean, it's very optimistic. I don't know that we'll ever get to zero, given that accidents will happen. I mean, all it takes is a forklift backing into a compressor and boom, you've blown your full charge. But do I think those things are completely unavoidable? No, absolutely not. But I do think the more data points that we have and better machine learning, better AI and human, honestly, analysis and diagnostics, and for that matter, like we said before, prognostics moving in that direction, I do believe we can get a heck of a lot closer to zero than we are today. And again, it is a paradigm shift. It's not about finding the leak and fixing it. It's about avoiding the leak in the first place. And that's what I mean about getting to zero, is like, we can't continue to think or believe that leaks are just always going to happen. I think with the additional data and cloud analytics that folks like your team, Amrit, are providing, we are going to get a heck of a lot closer to that number of 0 than we would have otherwise gotten if we didn't start to engage these conversations.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. It's cool to reframe the conversation in that way. It's really exciting, in fact. Yeah, so I mean, the way that we think about cloud analytics helping this problem is basically look at the receiver, look at the condenser, which are the most common places where refrigerant is pooling up, and then use essentially enthalpy trends to understand what's going on in each of those two components, and then watch those trends over time. Obviously, you got to normalize for store load, you got to normalize for weather, you got to normalize for major swings in the refrigerant levels, such as condenser splits, heat reclaims turning on, things like that. But ultimately, what that enables us to do is, again, it's adding that digital gas needle to the refrigeration system to understand how are things changing over time, and then identify those trends much earlier than what we understand has ever really been done in the past. And we're hopeful that applying this sort of technique is going to have a major industry effect in terms of reducing those leak rates industry-wide. So with that, I want to move to our final topic, the last of 4 major challenges the industry is facing today. And I think in many cases, this is the most painful one that people think about the most. And a word that's thrown around a lot here is Band-Aids. And so, harkening back to that conversation, Tristam, from earlier, basically, facilities and maintenance staff today, almost everyone I talk to in this space, almost everyone that we interact with says that we ask them, what's your biggest problem? They say, I need more hours in the day, or I need more people on my team, or I need more resources, basically. And you ask them, how do they spend their day and how do they spend their week? And you ask them that same question day after day, week after week, and it's always the same answer, which is, I was running around like a crazy person putting out fires. That's all I have time to do because I'm just surrounded by fires and I have to pick the biggest fire and solve that one first. But then there's 4 other fires right after that I have to go deal with. And so that is good. It's really good we have those firefighters, in this industry putting out those fires all the time. But unfortunately, these folks are not able to make any real progress in terms of avoiding the fires before they even start because they're so busy putting them out. So in other words, they're unable to kind of improve the status quo or move the industry forward because they're so busy just sprinting to stay in place. And so I want to bring another split incentive question, and this goes back to Band-Aids, into the discussion here. And that is, maintenance technicians are not bad, they're not evil, they're not trying to do things that are going to hurt the end user. But unfortunately, the incentives are all wrong. When a maintenance technician or a service tech walks into a grocery store, they have an enormous amount of time pressure and money pressure on them. And so what they want to do is they want to keep the food cold today. And they want to do that as fast as possible. That's really all they care about. And what they don't care about is optimizing the store for energy or maintenance costs in the long run. And so I know that's kind of a maybe inflammatory statement, but Tristam or Pete, or maybe Tristam, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Technicians are not evil, right? They're not trying to do the wrong thing. They are trying to address the immediate issue. And the immediate issue, more often than not, is my food is not cold and it needs to be cold, and it's going to cause health safety issues it's going to cause labor issues if I have to remove this product. It's going to cause loss of sales, it's going to loss of product, all of the above, right? And that is the undying pressure that you will get from an owner operator when you walk into their facility. And that message is hammered home and has been hammered home for decades upon decades. So yeah, they're not thinking about, again, systemically solving the root cause of the issue. They're thinking about addressing what needs to be addressed immediately to get the system to where it needs to be. And more often than not, you will see Band-Aids because they're not just focused on that call. They're focused on the 4 or 5 other calls that are piling up from other stores for the same retailer or other retailers. And it's they can't prioritize one over the other, right? That's the challenge, is that everyone's a priority. And any owner operator will have you believe that they're the highest priority, but so will their friend down the street. So it's it's not an easy fix by any means. And this goes back to the challenge that we were talking about before with the split incentive. How do we get this information into their hands earlier, right? And how do we get them to utilize that information so that they can take advantage of I would say, data before they walk into the store completely blind, because more often than not, they are walking into the store completely blind. And they're going to do what they can do to get the system up to where it needs to be. And honestly, I would say I couldn't put a specific percentage on it, but it's high enough that it's recognized. And anecdotally speaking, I would say that, at least 10 to 15% of the time, when they walk out, they're going to be back the next day, if not later that day, to fix a similar, if not the same issue. And that needs to stop, I think, is the easiest way of putting it. I think, yeah, I mean, we could probably talk about some of the band-aids we've seen in the space. Pete probably knows them better, having been on the service technician side for many years. And I always, I mean, we giggle about them after the fact, but it's a real issue. When you do start to recognize some of the things that have been done, and they cause safety issues, food safety, safety in general, and obviously they cost a lot of money in the long run.
Yeah, I think you hit a key point there, which is that we're putting the technicians in a really impossible position by making them go faster and faster and do T&M not to exceed, and 15 service calls in a day, et cetera. What would you do in that situation? You do the same exact thing, most likely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the part that just really gets me is that we're actively making that problem worse by, it becomes a cycle, essentially. Just like you said, you force a tech to move too fast, and you send them into the store blind. You say they have to solve the problem in under an hour or something like that. They can't figure out what it is, so they put a Band-Aid on. Then they're back later that day. Suddenly you quadrupled the amount of time it should have actually taken to solve the root cause, and you still haven't even solved the root cause. And so suddenly the problem is 5 times worse than it was before we even started, because we're putting all this pressure on the techs, because we're putting them in this impossible position. So I guess, Pete, you've been on the receiving end of this before, back in the early part of your career when you were a tech, and I guess now you've been on the giving end as well, as being a leader in the field and sending techs out. So what are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Well, it's thoughts and actions, because we've actually put it into practice. The compressors don't die, they are killed is an absolute true statement. It's either run out of oil or liquid has diluted the oil. And we have very few stores that have any type of telemetry to tell you anything other than the oil failure's already occurred. Excuse me just a second. And more importantly, we're seeing more and more loop stores that you can't see the individual line sets. So the only way to determine where you might be having liquid diluting the oil is to physically go to each circuit out on the sales floor and put a meter on it. It's just an enormous amount of time. So we've actually installed sensors on all those loop suction lines, so we can see immediately the temperature has dropped to an unrealistic place where it should be. And before any failure occurs, diagnose the problem is in that case. And that's really the only way you can stop liquid floodback, is getting to it before it damages a compressor. The oil system, it's just a couple of sensors you have to put on there, and you could determine before they run out of oil that you're going to run out of oil days ahead of time. And now you've got a planned maintenance where you can likely just change a filter, something very simple that doesn't have extensive downtime for the store, product being pulled. All those bad things can go away with just a handful of sensors. So we've taken that tack. I don't know, we've probably got a couple dozen stores that that's put in. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, these events don't happen all the time. But the few times they have happened in those stores, it's guaranteed in my mind that this is absolutely the way to go. So we've rewritten a couple of customer install specs to start getting this extra telemetry installed from the get-go. And the more data points you have, the more AI can work in your benefit.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that into the conversation, Pete. Basically, a great example of how, kind of getting out of this break fix, putting out fire cycle, and trying to get out ahead of problems by, monitoring the key inputs that are causing the vast majority of problems before they turn into a big reactive, hair on fire emergency. Compressor being the example that Pete brought up. I fully agree with that. We're catching these all the time. Basically, There's some, Pete, I think you mentioned 95% of compressors are killed, only about 5% really die by themselves.
Yeah, it's very rare. It's liquid dilution or lack of oil, one or the other.
Yep. And so, if we're able to basically monitor those types of failure modes, then suddenly we can get out ahead of problems before they turn into emergency, and avoid this whole situation where we're putting techs in a bad spot where they have to put Band-Aids on, et cetera, and do a bunch of repeat site visits or spend an enormous amount of money on a brand new compressor and an emergency change out in the middle of the night, et cetera. We covered a lot of ground today. This has been really, really fantastic. In the interest of making sure that a lot of voices are heard here, we're going to pause and move to Q&A. So we have about 10 minutes left, and Turner, one of my colleagues, is going to basically start reading out questions that we've received. And if you haven't already, feel free to put some questions into the Q&A box using the Zoom function there. So Turner, do you want to begin feeding some questions over to us?
Yeah, definitely. We got quite a few here, so we'll try to keep things moving and get to as many as we can. But here's one that came in during the discussion about the shortage of qualified technicians. It's a bit of a long one, so give me a second here while I read it, but probably more relevant for either you, Tristam, or Pete first. Says, as someone who has fought the battle over preventive maintenance versus fighting fires from both the grocer and vendor point of view, I believe that increasing maintenance revenue spend for a short period, 6 months or so that the fires can be addressed while a maintenance team does the work of ensuring improved future reliability. My question to the group is, has anyone had success or failure with a funding surge? If successful, were they able to maintain the improved reliability long-term?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that was kind of what I was getting at with the split incentive piece. I mean, a lot of it is solved by whether you call it a funding surge or readdressing contracts, right? Putting more ownership and partnership in the hands of the suppliers or service vendors is critically important. And you really want to create a model whereby, in my mind, you have preventative maintenance route, so that it's not completely break, fix, and time and material. You do have more of an inclusive contract, and this is just kind of my personal opinion, some of what I employed during my time on the owner operator side. I think it worked quite well. It takes some time to recognize that funding surge return, but in my mind, it's critically important. And believe me, it's not always easy to push for that, and it's not always easy to push for solutions that we're talking about today, because they do cost more money on the upfront. Which is really oftentimes hard to convince the powers that be to spend that money on the upfront. But if you do, I've always seen a return in my experience. And I think we need to continue to kind of beat that drum in many respects, because that's the only way we're going to get out ahead of this limited bandwidth and challenges with walking around with a fire extinguisher on our back trying to put out fires, is to create a true partnership in the industry, give as much data to the folks that are doing the service work as possible, and create a partnership whereby those split incentives are removed, and we can get out ahead of some of these break fix issues with preventative maintenance and, again, better data.
In my mind, the preventive maintenance is only as good as the technician performing it, and I've been burned way too many times with paying a guy for 8 hours or sometimes 40 hours, depending on the contract, and getting no return for it. I think cleaning of evaporators and condensers certainly plays a part, has to be done. But everything else, I'd rather put in the hands of technology and just have the telemetry to tell me what the heck's going on and target him to things that are not working. I just don't think I get the return on those multi-day preventive maintenance events. They just never seem to work out by and large.
Yeah, I would say one thing in response to that. I think if we have the visibility that I think cloud analytics can provide, and again, this isn't always possible or doesn't always exist, but to make sure that we have the oversight of that preventative maintenance being done. And again, as Pete just said, being more targeted with what the preventative maintenance actually includes on both the upfront, so the data before, and then the oversight after with the data points. I think that's critically important. And one thing I'll say on that front is, I look at, as much as AI and machine learning and cloud analytics and all of this is going to be critically important as we move into the future of refrigeration, HVAC, and all the other industries that these technologies are being applied to. There's a critical human element that needs to continue to be a major piece of this equation, and you can't remove that. It's a matter of optimizing that relationship between the technology and the service providers and everyone else involved in making this successful. And if you think you can do one without the other, in other words, there's a lot of organizations out there. Axiom Cloud is not one of them, that I think believe that SaaS offerings are going to provide 100% of the service. It's not true. You need that human element. You need the engagement on the owner operator side, the service provider side, in order to really hit the, I think, goals that we're all talking about.
I want to add one thing here, which is that, I think that in the past, people have thought, hey, in order to get ahead of things, I need a big funding surge. I need to kind of increase workload in the short term. I'm actually not sure I agree with that kind of underlying assumption, in the sense that, there's a lot of small incremental things that can be done, such as, right now in this month, if you start a new program where you're using cloud analytics to help inform the techs and understand, so they understand what's going on before they walk in the store. They understand that, hey, if I'm on site and I have a little extra time, or I'm here, my truck is here, I've already paid the truck roll fee, let me fix these 3 other little tiny things while I'm here. Starting to make some of those types of changes, and then avoiding all those follow-on visits and those follow-on work orders, and Band-Aids and things like that, or hours walking around the store trying to figure out which case is broken when, Cloud Analytics could tell you which one it is before you even walk in the store. Those sorts of investments can pay off in a matter of hours during the site visit even. And so it's not a question of, hey, am I going to see benefits next month or in 6 months or in a year, or am I going to get my payback? I think making those adjustments right now can start paying dividends during that site visit and tomorrow and the day after. And so suddenly a larger and larger percentage over time of the work you're doing is about pushing the ball forward, improving the status quo, and a smaller and smaller percent of the work that you're doing is about putting out fires. If you're starting to make some of these changes and enabling your whole team to work more intelligently using cloud analytics. So I wanted to push back on the concept of a funding surge, essentially. I'm not sure that that's necessarily required to enable a big change.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Funding surge seems pretty aggressive. I think it is, an incremental increase in cost on the upfront versus waiting to pay it on the back end. I think it's the surge you'll see is the surge on the back end if you don't get out ahead of these things, because when a compressor is killed, not fails, right? When a compressor is killed, that's going to cost you a lot of money, and if you can avoid that, that's the end goal, right? Avoid major failures.
Yeah, and then you can use that data to focus on another initiative that pushes the ball forward rather than, yelling at whoever to ship your compressor faster.
Correct.
Yep. Yeah, I'll try to get to a couple more. I know we're going to try to end right at 10. I know a lot of people probably have back-to-back meetings these days. So here's a quick one. Would you share the recorded video with today's attendees? Yes, anybody that is registered will receive the recording afterwards. And then we have one other one that's related to, pretty related to what you were just saying, Tristam, about how we need that human element in there too. I know you and I, Amrit, have talked a lot about this too. So here's the question. It came in during the last discussion about Band-Aids. It's, as Pete said, it's about risk reward with monitoring what the techs are doing after they fix things. Is it not worth having someone go in remotely after a tech has done something to determine the impact of every service call?
We do that now. I wouldn't say on every service call, but any call that we've been alerted to help diagnose. Part of the process is making sure they actually fixed it. And believe me, it's about a 50% hit rate where they actually got it right. So there's got to be some human intervention with that technician at some point. Even if it's just a simple, more than you can put on an email or a message to get it across to him what actually needs to be fixed. But again, you're doing that within a day. Usually we do it the first thing in the morning. And if it wasn't repaired, we're right back at the manager saying, get him back out there because this is not fixed yet.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there is streamlining that process is extremely important. And I don't think anyone's really kind of completely figured that out yet. I think it would be great if we could provide that level of oversight on every service call. And I think we're moving in that direction with tools like the ones that we're talking about, but figuring out the process by which you can streamline that. So it's not, you have to talk to the manager and then get somebody back out. Like, how do you start to break down some of the barriers to make that more efficient?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to add into the conversation, which is that, if you think about a lot of the things that these cloud analytics tools are doing, a lot of them are really dead simple, to be totally frank. Like watching traces, watching trends over time. These are not, this is not crazy rocket science. This is basically things that a human could easily do. The problem is that it's not cost effective for humans to sit and watch traces all day long. It just doesn't make any sense. Computers can do that for, a tiny fraction of the cost. So cloud analytics is definitely, in our vision, is not going to replace humans. It's going to supplement them. It's going to make them able to do more valuable things and focus more on high value projects and less on watching traces over time. And so, thinking about how you actually solve a problem in a grocery store, first you have to identify it, and then diagnose it, and then fix it. But that last critical piece that Pete was talking about is then you got to confirm that the root cause was actually correctly addressed. And if not, you start over. And so, if you don't close the loop with that last piece, you're going to kind of be back in a firefighting situation. So completely agree with Pete. And the cloud analytics can help in every single one of those 4 steps. Just making it more efficient, reducing the amount of human time that needs to be spent on the most boring, repetitive parts of each one of those 4 steps.
All right, great. We got 60 seconds or so here. There was one more question that, Amrit, I wanted to give you 30 seconds on, and then maybe you can just jump from that into a conclusion here. It says, kind of a more broad question. Don't most companies already have alarm monitoring in place? How is what you're talking about any different?
Love it.
Maybe that could probably be its own webinar, but I'll give you 30 seconds.
So alarm monitoring is you look at a threshold, you say, point X has been out of range for Y seconds. So it's a reactive threshold alarm. That's the status quo. Those are really great. They're really necessary. They're critically important to the space, to making sure that there are not huge problems. But ultimately, what we're doing is fundamentally different in that our goal and cloud analytics goal is about avoiding those entirely by addressing or identifying, diagnosing, and fixing the problems before those alarms ever go off in the first place. So it's not replacing those alarms at all. It's a different value proposition that helps to reduce those total number of alarms, reduce those total numbers of emergencies, and streamline operations, maintenance, sustainability, energy. So we are out of time. Really appreciate the participation of everyone here today. Tristam and Pete, we love hearing your thoughts on this industry, and we really appreciate the leadership that you provide in the space and the thought leadership, and we're excited to kind of continue the journey with you guys. So thank you so much for participating. We do want to continue the conversation with everyone here today, key industry stakeholders, so that we can accelerate this industry transformation together. So again, feel free to reach out to any of us via email if you have questions. If you want to explore how cloud analytics can help you solve some of your biggest problems today, we'd love to help. Feel free to reach out, and we will follow up via email with a link to the slides and a recording. So thanks all for your participation. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Amrit. Thanks, team.
Bye.